Welcome to Psychology of Pilgrimage. In this episode, I am joined by Allison Finkelstein, who is an historian and author of the book Forgotten Veterans, Invisible Memorials: How American Women Commemorated the Great War, 1917 to 1945. Good morning, Allison. It is a phenomenal privilege to be able to spend some time speaking with you today about your work, particularly around women and commemoration and women and memorialization. And so thank you so much for taking the time over the weekend to speak with me about your career and about you as a person and what drew you into your career as a historian.
Well, thank you for having me, Heather. I'm really excited and honored to be here, and I'm just excited to see your face too, because I haven't seen you since we were in France.
Yes, which is actually hard to believe, but it was 2 years ago. So the time has flown by. I'd like to start by talking about the book for which the presentation in France was based on. The new volume, that the edited volume that I'm publishing about the conference, that includes the papers from the conference, does not include your paper because you've already published this information in a book. But I did want to acknowledge that you were a very valuable contributor to the conference, and your presence and your topic area were really informative, and I think shed a lot of light for those of us from the United States about Gold Star Mothers pilgrimages, but also for our French colleagues. And the name of your book is Forgotten Veterans, Invisible Memorials. And I'd love to hear an overview about the book and also what led to you writing the book to begin with.
Yes, thank you. So, my book, the title is Forgotten Veterans, Invisible Memorials: How American Women Commemorated the Great War. And it has two main arguments that it makes, which are each tied to the title. So, I'll start first with the invisible memorials, because that's a really important part of the pilgrimage aspect of the book. I argue that women who somehow served or sacrificed during World War I, by their own definition, which is important, believed that one of the best, most effective ways to commemorate it was not through constructing monuments or building memorials, but actually through deeds of service or acts of advocacy. So they were really pushing for a more abstract type of memorialization that didn't result in something physically on the landscape, but was instead focused on the survivors of the war, on helping families and veterans, the wounded, on memorializing through acts of kindness, through acts that helped make the world a better place. So those are the invisible memorials of the book. The second part of the title, The Forgotten Veterans, has to do with a segment of those women, many of whom served during the war in uniform and under oath, but were not actually part of the military. So these are women like the Hello Girls, the Signal Corps telephone operators, the Reconstruction aides, who were physical and occupational therapists, and many other women. They believed that their service as uniformed civilians during the war made them what they called unrecognized veterans. And they were pushing for recognition of that service. And they believed that recognition of that service was the type of memorialization they had earned. So there's those two parts of the book, the forgotten veterans and the invisible memorials. And as you read it, you see how those women are all connected.
When you talk about the community service or civil service and the deeds as being, would you classify this as a living memorial? Is that I there I s- can we call it a living memorial? The deed itself is a living memorial?
I think that as scholars today, we can call it a living memorial, but the women back then would not have considered all of their memorial projects to be living memorials. So, to get into that explanation, let's define what a living
Please.
memorial is. So, talking about the immediate post war era in the United States, at least, a living memorial was designed as some sort of built structure or built item that had a commemorative aspect but also served a function. So I can share a couple examples. In Washington, D.C., there's the District of Columbia War Memorial, which is now nestled right near the World War II Memorial, but of course it predates that. It's a beautiful marble bandstand, and it has the names inscribed on it of the residents of the District of Columbia who died in World War I. But it had a functional purpose as a bandstand, and it was intended for concerts as a way to memorialize the dead by bringing joyful music to the people of Washington, D.C. So it had a function, and it was also a memorial. Another great one is the National World War I Memorial in Kansas City, which of course was originally known as Liberty Memorial. It has a really tall, beautiful tower, which provided views to people from that tower of the city, but it also memorialized World War I. So that's what those women would have considered living memorials. Another type of living memorial was a memorial tree, and these are still really popular today, where you plant a tree in memory of something or a battle or a unit, and the tree, by being a living organism, creates new life while memorializing the dead. So that's what the women of my book would have understood as living memorials. Today, I think as scholars, we could classify some of their less tangible memorial projects as living memorials. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. An example would be some of the women raised funds for blinded veterans, and they sent that money off to help them. That could be considered a living memorial, or just another way to phrase it, as I did in the book, is to create a new definition for that kind of commemoration. My advisor in graduate school, Dr. Saverio Giovacchini, really pushed me when I was working on this project to find a term, a neologism, to really define what I was talking about. So I created the term veteranism with a lot of input from him, and we workshopped a lot of ideas and threw a lot of them out. We came upon veteranism, which I define as commemoration that places the plight of male and female veterans at the center of its activities. So that's not a term that the women of my book used during their lifetimes, but it's something that I use to try and more succinctly describe what they're talking about. And my hope was that if the book could reach people who are maybe doing commemorative projects today, they could be inspired to think about veteranism as a type of memorialization to pursue.
I've got so many questions now. Um, uh, the first, I want to link the living memorial uh, part of your explanation to work I've been doing in Bella Wood and Bellow, because there are some very fine examples of living memorials through the Pennsylvania Fountain, which is a wellhead which was created so that the residents would have fresh water. There is also the reconstruction of the town, which was overseen by the American Committee for a Devastated France, viewed the buildings as living memorials in exactly the way you've just described, that they would be usable structures and also serve a commemorative purpose. And that living memorial concept has extended right up to the present with an initiative to plant oak saplings across the United States, at least the eastern part of the United States, where the environment is conducive for that, to commemorate the battle inside Bella Wood, and to also continue that commemorative purpose, but in the United States. So I could easily wrap my head around concrete, tangible examples of living memorials, and then also this concept of veteranism is really interesting to me, and I'm hoping to camp out a bit more uh, around what types of service you have envisioned, or the women of the post-war era envisioned as commemorative acts that would fall under this concept of veteranism.
Yes, thank you. Well, just to start, to go back to the examples you gave from the Bella Wood area, those are exactly what I mean by living memorials as defined in the post World War I era, and that's why it was so meaningful to be able to present my paper at Chateau Thierry and point to my slides and say the Pennsylvania Fountain, which is just a couple miles from here. It was really amazing to be able to connect on that landscape. So the women of my book, they did really embrace living memorials as we just defined them. Um, but some of them also pushed to go even further. They wanted to take the idea of a living memorial and make it a little bit more extreme by not even creating a building or a fountain. So I think the best way to get into that is to take the example of the Women's Overseas Service League, who formed the subject of one of the book's chapters. This was basically a veterans organization open to any woman living in the United States who somehow served overseas during the World War. And they banded together to maintain their bonds of friendship and continue serving. And they were offered many different opportunities to participate in both traditional memorials and living memorials. And I go into that in the book. And time again, they would say, thank you, but we're not going to participate because they said our motto is the best memorial to the dead is service to the living. So, service to the living was how they wanted to focus their memorial efforts and particularly their limited finance. So, how did they do that? They did that by first and foremost helping other female veterans, especially unrecognized female veterans. So the women who were recognized veterans, like the Army and Navy nurses, the Yeoman F, and the female Marines, those women who, due to a loophole in the law, were allowed to actually join the military, they had full veterans benefits. That meant they had hospitalization, they had burial in a national cemetery, and that they would be eligible for a bonus when the whole wartime bonus issue came about. The other women were not. So the Hello Girls, the reconstruction aides, the dietitians, many of the women who served as nurses with the Red Cross, they had no veterans benefits, although many of them dealt with health issues after the war due to their wartime service. So the Women's Overseas Service League spent a lot of time and effort on raising money to help those women, whether it was to help pay for medical care, to send them care packages in hospitals. They really focused on helping those women who they felt were left behind by the government. And at the same time, they also advocated. They advocated for those women to be retroactively given veteran status. And during their lifetime, they mostly were unsuccessful. And they advocated for the next generation of military women to be given a better position and situation than them. And that's a story that takes us into World War II with women who served in World War I now in leadership positions, able to push and advocate for those women to actually get veterans recognition.
Were the women who were serving in these capacities, were they all doing so under the umbrella of an official organization like the Red Cross or the YWCA or the Hello Girls? Were Was there an organizational affiliation, or did individual women who may have volunteered to serve during the war or after the war with wounded veterans, for example, did they also consider their service in this way?
That's a really important question. So, most of the women that I look at in the book served in an official capacity, but not within the armed forces. So let's take the example of the Hello Girls because I think they're more well known. And if they're not well known, there's a group of us who are working to make them more well known, which we can talk about. So the Hello Girls were civilians and they worked directly for the U.S. Army Signal Corps. So they were hired by the Signal Corps, paid for by the Signal Corps, had paperwork signed by the military, took an oath, but they were not in the military. So they didn't have an umbrella organization. They were just directly working for the military. In some ways, you can kind of think of them like civilian contractors today, although they wouldn't have called it that, but it's the closest equivalent I could think. They weren't federal civil service employees. and they weren't in the military, but they were directly paid for and hired. So that was part of what made it so confusing. It was the same situation for the Reconstruction aides. Then there are a lot of other women who were in the US who did all sorts of volunteer work, whether it was with an organization or on their own. And in the book's introduction, I think it is, I try to make a distinction that when I talk about these unrecognized female veterans, I'm not talking about the women who were sewing bandages or knitting socks, which I don't want to downplay. That was very important. But those were more traditional female domestic types of volunteer work for the war. The women that I'm looking at who called themselves unrecognized veterans were taking things to a new level. They were serving in a more official capacity outside of the armed forces. They were wearing a uniform. Sometimes they were with the YMCA, the YWCA. That's a little bit different, right? They weren't necessarily saying that they should have veteran status, but many of these women believed they should be recognized as veterans. And part of the reason is because there just were not that many other opportunities for women to serve. So they were carving out a place for themselves within what was allowed.
And many of these women in the women's organizations play a crucial role in the pilgrimages. Uh, even groups of students from Smith College and Wellesley were, uh, in particular, in the Belleau and Lucy Le Bocage area, and playing a critical role in the years following the war. And we don't know much about their stories either. And I don't know if they would fall under this category of veteran. Um, I don't think they would, because many of the service actually happened at the end of the war, or in, these 5 years or 8 years following the war.
And that's not something that I've looked into that much. So I couldn't say with a lot of confidence right now, but I think probably not because the women that I look at who called themselves these unrecognized veterans, they had a pretty clear definition of that they were in uniform, they were there during the war or immediately after because
Mhm.
there was a lot to do in that period from 1918 to 1919, 1920. But they really saw their service as equivalent to military service.
We talk a lot on this podcast about the concept of liminality and liminal space, and it seems like these women actually occupy liminal space in that they're not quite civilians and they're not quite would be quite military veterans, and so their story is interesting just in that respect, that they're kind of neither here nor there. They sit in this kind of suspended space, which is an exciting area, I think, as a researcher, to be able to study that space.
Hadn't thought to use the term of liminality with them before, but I think that's exactly what it is, and I will definitely start incorporating that into my speaking about them because it's what they were dealing with. They weren't in the military, but they weren't not in the military. And many of these women were quite confused about their status. And you can't really blame them if you sign paperwork, you take an oath, and you're wearing a uniform, told you have to follow the military's rules and regulation. If you're not somebody who knows the difference between being in the military and not, it's very unclear who you actually are working for.
Fascinating group of people. I can hear very much why you would be drawn to their stories and to telling the stories, and to also the advocacy work that you're doing in the case of the Hello Girls, to work towards a greater recognition of their service and the impact of their service. I would like to actually ask you about a couple of terms that I hear popping up in odd places at the moment. And the terms have to do with, well, they're commemoration, remembrance, and memorialization. And I'd like to hear specific definitions from your perspective about what those terms mean.
This is such a good question because in scholarly circles, in communities that are working on commemorative projects, these terms get thrown about, and it seems that nobody can really agree on the difference between them and what they mean. So I'll give you my definitions, but I just want to state this is just what Allison thinks and how I use them. It's not necessarily the only way, and other people may have different ones. Okay, so commemoration. I think about commemoration in my work as activities that are done to ensure that the memory of a person or an event has not been forgotten, but it's not in a mournful way. So it's more about the legacy and the impact of the person or event that you're thinking about rather than dealing with grief. So for me, a commemorative memorial would be the Montfaucon American Monument or the Chateau Thierry American Monument. Those are commemorative works in that they are, in some ways, glorifying the units that served in those campaigns. And it's not a place of mourning, but a place looking at a victory, remembering a victory. So that to me is more commemorative in its tone. Whereas memorialization, in my mind, is more about grieving and mourning, remembering the dead, ensuring that they're not going to be forgotten. So for me, memorialization, an example would be in a small town if they have a local World War I memorial that has a plaque with the names of the dead written on it. That is more memorialization. They might also have a doughboy statue there. And that doughboy statue, to me, would be more commemorative, looking at the valor of the service members, but then contrasted at many of these local memorials with the plaque with the names that's memorializing them, giving people a place to pour out their grief. And then remembrance, I think of as a bigger category of different kinds of activities, ensuring that communities and cultures are looking back on the past and remembering it. Hopefully that gives us something to go off of. People out there in the audience can argue with me and disagree with me. And I reserve the right to change my mind.
As you are giving the definitions, I'm actually changing my mind about my book chapter in this edited volume about the conference. I address the topic of this concept comes from ecological psychology, and it's the concept of affordance. That an environment can offer a particular kind of affordance. So, in the case of Bella Wood, the trees themselves offer an affordance because they provide this sort of dark ambient space that they're but for people who know something about the battle, and they will remember seeing images of these mangled trees, and so then when visiting the woods, there's this association. But also the pathways through the woods offer an affordance of being able to meander and to reflect and to look, left and right and forward and think about the war and the service members who were inside these woods. Also, the natural features in the woods afford the opportunity to bring something home, or to plant saplings from the acorns, or to take dirt, the soil, or to bring a branch. And this type of affordance I've labeled in the chapter a commemorative affordance. So this type of affordance has not really been discussed in the literature up to this point, and so I label it commemorative affordance because it gives the traveler, the pilgrim, the opportunity for ongoing commemoration every time a branch is looked at or the sapling is viewed or the dirt is maybe seen in some type of uh, uh, glass jar, or even the water from the Devil Dog fountain, which is brought back. But I actually think that this may be all three. So the affordances here are commemorative, but they're also memorialization affordances, and they're also remembrance affordances. So if I could edit this chapter, I would say that it's actually all three. It's not only the commemorative affordances that the environment provides for. It's actually all three. So that's the next piece of writing, I guess, is to amend this and say, actually, I think all three affordances are offered in the case of Bellawood.
And that's really insightful. I haven't heard about affordance more, so I look forward to reading that in the chapter. But I think that you hit upon something really important. Something can be all types of what we're calling
Hmm.
commemorative actions. It can
Yes.
be commemoration, remembrance, and memorialization at once. And I also think it's important, particularly in the context of pilgrimages, that the pilgrim themselves can define what it is. Just because I think that the Montfaucon American Memorial is more commemorative in nature, to one of those Gold Star women, it may have been memorialization to them. And that's what I think is so interesting when looking at pilgrimages. It's about the human aspect. It's not just what the scholar thinks, but what the person in the past or in the present for present day pilgrimages, how they define it.
That's true, and I'm thinking specifically of a pilgrim mother from New Hampshire named Mrs. Fraser, whose son was missing in action. And she made several pilgrimages, but during her pilgrimage in 1925, she left a notation in the visitor registry of the cemetery stating that she was there looking for the ground where her son had been killed. And for her, the part of this pilgrimage that was important was not his gravestone, because he didn't have one. So this was a completely different type of experience. She needed to touch the ground itself where she believed he had been killed. And so to your point about pilgrims viewing different elements in these battlescapes in different ways, to one, the ground may be important because it represents a victory or a birthplace. A Marine visiting may see this as the birthplace of the modern Marine Corps, and touching that ground is sort of touching an earthen womb, so to speak. But for another person, it is the exact place of death in a very personal way. And so what people are seeking in the same space is very different from person to person.
That's a great point.
Let's get into some more terms, because it actually influences the post-war pilgrimages, these concepts. And the two terms I'd like to explore are sacrifice and hero, which you beautifully addressed in your presentation at the conference, and also in your book. And so I'd like to hear you expand a bit on those two terms.
Yes, so I think for the word sacrifice, let's use the Gold Star pilgrimages as our example. And I'm sure your listeners have heard about them, but I'll just give a sentence in case you have any new listeners for this episode. During the 1930s, the US government paid for the mothers and widows of service members who were buried or memorialized in the overseas World War I cemeteries to go and visit those graves or walls of the missing at the government's expense on fully organized trips. So the Gold Star pilgrimages were the result of years of effort, of lobbying by Gold Star mothers and Gold Star widows who believed that their sacrifices, and this comes from their own words, which I explore in the book. I don't have the quotes memorized, so you can go to the book to find those primary sources. But to paraphrase, these women were essentially arguing that through the loss of their husband or their child, they too had sacrificed for the nation. And that sacrifice deserved to be recognized, particularly because they made a further sacrifice for the United States by choosing to have those remains buried overseas if they had a choice, or for the relatives of the missing, who are really important and sometimes get overlooked, I think. The relatives of the missing didn't have a choice, and they had no known grave to visit, and that was an even further form of sacrifice. So these are women who were not calling themselves unrecognized veterans. They're different than the Hello Girls or the Reconstruction Aids. But I grouped them together in the book because they were pursuing the same type of veteranist memorial activities. So these women, the Gold Star mothers and widows, they were defining those sacrifices as a type of military service. Even though they were not saying they were veterans, they were saying they had served the military, they had served the country. And the way they wanted to be memorialized and commemorated was not through a statue, not through a plaque, but through an action, through the government funded and sponsored pilgrimages. That was the memorial they wanted to their sacrifice. And it left no permanent trace on the landscape, which we can talk about, but it was a memorial to them nonetheless. So I'll pause there for sacrifice if you want to ask any questions before we turn to your other term, hero.
I I I would like to offer
Sure.
a case that illustrates this point. Another Gold Star mother from the state of New Hampshire, Mrs. Bridget LeMay, traveled on one of the pilgrimages. I believe she went in 1932. She travels to Marne American Cemetery, the Marne American Cemetery in Bellow, where her son, Private Victor LeMay, is buried. He was part of the Yankee Division's 103rd Infantry Regiment. And the pilgrimage was an important part of her identity, so much so that when she was interviewed in for a number of newspaper articles, she references the son Victor LeMay, who died, and gives a sort of cursory nod to his brother who had come back. He doesn't play a large role in her sacrifice. It is very much the son that she lost. And so later on in the 1930s, she dies, and her grave has a notation as if her son Victor LeMay was buried there. So her name is on the gravestone, and her son's name is on the gravestone. The grave then becomes a pilgrimage site for other Gold Star mothers. So, this idea of sacrifice very much plays a role in her last decade of life, and she becomes known through the death of her son, and then her grave itself. Then I have a photo of other Gold Star mothers coming on a pilgrimage to see her grave, and it's just an interesting encapsulation of what you've just talked about, because the sacrifice is seen in the context of the son who died and not necessarily the son who lived, even though there was great sacrifice through his service as well.
Such a great example. And I think it really illustrates how, as you said, being a Gold Star mother or widow became part of many of these women's identity. And it became a mark of what they did for the country. And one of the things that I love about your research is that because you're focused, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, much more on Bella Wood and Ain Marn, you're getting to more of these case studies and specific examples of the women on the pilgrimages. And I think it's such a great way to take from the larger work that historians have been doing, starting with Lisa Boudreau, a
Mhm.
friend of mine, her excellent work, Bodies of War, which really was, I would say, the piece of solid historical scholarship that brought the pilgrimages more into the conversation of World War I historians. And then I look at it from a different perspective, from the commemorative angle, and then you bring in this more case study focus. I think it's such a great way to really take apart and analyze more deeply the meaning of these pilgrimages, which were really quite consequential, but not as many Americans know about them today as I think we think should know about them.
That's absolutely true. And also the pilgrimages, are framed in the context of the sons or husbands, being heroes and heroic, and I will open up and invite you to discuss this concept of hero because it also then, um, expands to include these mothers and widows.
So, this is where I'm going to venture away from what I wrote in the book to more of what I've been thinking in the past couple years as a military historian who's also a women's historian and a cultural historian. And when I share this, this is not what the women themselves said. This is what I, as a scholar, am thinking through in my analysis. In the field of military history, particularly in the public history realm, there's a big focus on heroes, battlefield heroes, battlefield valor, Medal of Honor recipients, those who were wounded in battle, Purple Hearts, stories of heroism that are really just so baffling to even understand how some of these service members were able to persevere through the situations that they were in. And that's an important part of teaching military history to the public. It's an important part of a battlefield staff ride. It's an important part of visiting a military cemetery. And am not in any way saying that we should downplay that. What I've been thinking about is how can we expand the narrative of military history and the idea of a military hero and military valor beyond those people who are always in the spotlight to different types of heroism. So that could be the heroism of a Gold Star mother or widow who suffers that terrible loss. General Pershing, there was a quote for him I have in the book. I'm going to paraphrase it here, but I think he said something along the lines of, those who sit at home and wait are the ones who make the larger sacrifice. Again, not the exact words, but those who are dealing every day with the trauma of losing a loved one, yet persevere through that. I want to ask people to consider, isn't that a type of heroism also? When you're at the Ain Marne American Cemetery and focused on those crosses and stars of David in front of you, think about the heroism of those mostly men, but also think about the heroism of the people they left behind, of the women who came on that Gold Star pilgrimage, which was a really kind of crazy, scary journey for a lot of these women, if you think about it. Some of them had never even left their home states, yet they get on a ship and go across the ocean. That's a type of heroism as well. There's also heroism in the service members who die of disease. With World War I, particularly the influenza pandemic, I think it's about half of American service members die of disease in World War I. They were also serving. Isn't that heroism too? What about the heroism of the nurses who put their own lives on the line during that pandemic? Over 200 of them, historians believe, died of disease during World War I. I want to add in more of those stories and expand the definition of heroism, not taking anybody out of the picture, but adding to the picture.
I think the this idea of expanding who gets to be classified as a hero or their actions or suffering categorized as heroism is fascinating also in the context of the post-war pilgrimages. And I have thought about and argued a bit in an article that the post-war pilgrimages for the veterans were a reenactment of the hero's journey. That this Joseph Campbell wrote about this archetypal hero's journey, where someone kind of sets out, they encounter challenges, they enter the kind of the depths of hell, they fight for their lives, and then they return with some type of elixir. And in the case of the original veterans of World War I, I suggest that that elixir is victory, that there is this sense that they are returning victorious. If we fast forward to 2025, and we look at Marines who are visiting Bellawood, we see that they're reenacting the Marines of June 1918. Often they're approaching the woods from exactly the same chronology, day by day. And they're inside the woods. They're contemplating this savage battle where their status as a Marine was tested, and then this pilgrimage then ends at the Devil Dog Fountain. And so up to really the last 20 years, this final step of returning with some type of elixir wasn't present for these reenactor Marines, even though they're also Marines, reenacting the Marines of 1918. And so, from a psychological standpoint, it makes perfect sense how the fountain could take on such a prominent role because now they're able to return with something. And it is the water from this fountain. After hearing your presentation in Chateau Thierry, I started thinking about the Gold Star mothers in light of this and the pilgrimages that they either were undertaking for those who could do so in the 20s, but definitely from 1930 to 1933 they also were reenacting a hero's journey. And just looking at the stages of the hero's journey, I mean, there's certainly sacrifice involved. Many of them got sick. Many of them are then encountering the moments, the final moments of their sons or their husbands. They're going to the grave, um, or going to the ground in the case of the missing where their loved one was killed. And I don't know what the return I don't know what they were maybe they were returning with some type of closure. I don't know that that final step was ever really enacted or reenacted in a concrete way. But your work did prompt me to think there was this other parallel process happening with the Gold Star mothers and widows that perhaps their journeys could also be framed in this larger archetypal hero's journey.
Very much think they could be. And hearing you talk about bringing an elixir home, I wonder if the photos that the women got of themselves at the graves, if there was a grave, is that could that be a type of memento that could be somewhat equivalent to the elixir? I don't know. Or the badges, those beautiful badges,
Yes,
military style that they wore, they did come home with tangible items. But I think what I want to touch on is something that you said that really struck me emotionally. Did these women ever get closure? And that's one of those questions that as a historian, I have to say I don't know. And the only people who could answer that for us would be those women. And some of them did write about their feelings and thoughts afterwards. I know Ethel Stratton Knock, who was able to pay for her own trips overseas before the pilgrimages and then advocated for the official pilgrimages in one on one. She talked about the emotional healing that she got from being at her son's grave and how she wanted other women to feel that. But we would have to ask each of them individually. And that's one of those situations where people ask you, "Oh, as a historian, who would you want to meet and talk to from the past?" I would love to talk to as many of those pilgrims as we could and find out how did it really impact them beyond the primary source records that we have. There were lots of women whose feelings were not recorded.
that's right. I included one account in this book chapter that I've previously mentioned about Mrs. Viola Robson from West Virginia, who I think we can glean a little bit about what this meant for her. She visits En Marne, and she's photographed at the grave of her son. And she says about the location in the cemetery, it's very fitting for this because he was a mountain boy and he's sitting at the base of Bella Wood. And so I think we can see that she's making meaning, even in the final resting place of her son, that she's linking this to home, that she sees this particular type of meaning here because of the location in the cemetery, which could have been uh, any number to over 2,000 locations right in the cemetery. But for her, the specificity of his grave was connected to their home, and there was a very particular type of meaning that she created because of the location of the grave. And I think it's beautiful. I think that the fact that she noted this in her journal gives us an indication of what was going on in her head at the time that she visited the grave and how important it was for her to link this to her home.
And it's the stories like that from the primary sources that really bring to life the cemeteries. You and I, we walk around cemeteries, we see stories, we see people. But I know from talking with other people and visitors to cemeteries that it's sometimes hard for visitors and tourists to understand what they're looking at. It looks like a sea of headstones. And that's where the interpretive mission of places like the American Battle Monuments Commission, of museums, of archives comes in to decode what people are looking at so that they can go to his headstone and understand that story. Not necessarily on the ground, but through a museum exhibit, through something digital. And that's what I was really trying to share in my presentation at the Chateau Thierry conference, that for the Gold Star pilgrimages, we don't see anything that attests to them on the landscape. It's an invisible memorial at this point. There were little rest houses, which I talk about in my book, in my article, that were created for the women, but were taken away after the pilgrimage program ended. So, as visitors are walking through these cemeteries and these sites, because the women went to the battlefields and the memorials as well, how do we bring that aspect out? How do we show, to go back to our idea of the expanded definition of a hero, that you had the battlefield heroes, but then you also had these other heroes who came back later, but you don't see any evidence of them?
It's so important, and it, I think, is why a pilgrimage perspective is so important overlaid on these battlescapes and landscapes, because it's as important to retrace the footsteps of a pilgrim mother as it is to retrace the footsteps of her son. And over in the case of the World War I cemeteries, over 100 years of pilgrims, which we can see snippets of their experiences when they left remarks in the cemetery registry, the visitor registry. So we can extrapolate a bit of the meaning there, but these spaces are so emotionally evocative, and because there have been so many people who have visited the space for very deeply meaningful reasons. Typically, people are not visiting cemeteries because they're looking for a leisure trip. The kind of okay, maybe in some cases that's the case. I would like to think that when people are visiting such places, they are doing so in some way that is reflective and is considering larger questions about why do we go to war, and what did this mean for service members, and what did it mean for families, and what does it mean in 2025 when we visit a military cemetery from the past. What can we, so in some way they become educational landscapes, but they also become platforms for existential questions that I think are important, from an ethical standpoint, and from an informed citizenry standpoint, that we question what it is that happened here and who visited these places.
And this makes me think of something that we touched on briefly before we started the recording, and that's the focus of staff rides. Staff ride being a guided, organized visit to a battlefield with the intention to learn. So thinking about staff rides, but also just heritage tourism focused on military history. So much of it is about tactics, battles, weaponries, famous leaders, generals. those battlefields would not even have survived to the present day for anybody to visit if they were not preserved for the purpose of pilgrimage. The cemeteries were created, yes, for practical purposes, but also to be sites of pilgrimage. So, to divorce military history from the pilgrimage aspect, from those emotional connotations, is very strange, but in some ways, it is what has happened. I grew up in Northern Virginia, and if anybody's listening is aware of Fair Oaks Mall in Fairfax. Fair Oaks Mall is built very close to the battlefield of Ox Hill, part of the Second Bull Run campaign during the Civil War. And as a kid, there was zero point 0.4 acres of it preserved. It's still preserved today. Zero point 0.4 acres. This tiny, tiny little pocket of Civil War battlefield that I would go to. But as my parents drove me all around to go to the mall, I would look around and say, my gosh, this whole area was a battlefield. But the only thing that's left is that little pocket. And that's the only place that people go to. That's the only place that's a pilgrimage site because General Kearney died there. So there was a famous general, which made that pocket more important. But the same thing can be extended to why battlefield preservation has happened in the first place. To be a site of pilgrimage for veterans, for later families, and then for people who are interested later. They're all pilgrims.
Those are really important points. And I want to come back to this divorce that you talk about, for divorcing sites maybe from their larger trauma or larger disaster. I recently talked to Dr. Philip Stone about his long career um, in the realm of dark tourism and dark pilgrimages, and so he focuses on sites of disaster, genocide, violence, military battles, and actions, martial actions. And our conversation has really prompted me to think about military cemeteries and battlefields and the way they are quote unquote used. And the lessons that are being extrapolated from them are often severed from the human cost and the traumatic toll on obviously those who fought and died there, but also their families and also the larger collective. We all suffer, I think, when the world is violent. And so I've actually just this week been thinking about ethics, the ethics of visiting battlefields and the ethics of visiting military cemeteries, and thinking about writing a piece on this because it's multifaceted and it's not just about extrapolating lessons on leadership or extrapolating lessons on tactics. There's something bigger here that is important, I think, to acknowledge that this is a site of atrocity, and sometimes we get caught up on what's above ground and not necessarily what's below ground, and what that meant for those people and their families and communities at the time that it happened.
Yeah, I think that's really important because it's so easy sometimes to just focus on the unit that was here and how many Germans was this one American service
Mhm.
member able to take out. These stories are fascinating, and when I give staff rides, I tell those stories as well. But military history is not just the battlefield tactics. It's the people who served, why they served, what was motivating them if they even had a choice. It's the larger meaning and impact on society, and including particularly when we think about the battlefields in France and Belgium, the civilian communities that lived around the
Yes.
sites of these massive long battles, how that impacted them. And I think for too long, military history has excluded a lot of these topics that could enhance it. as well as made some potential visitors to these sites feel like there isn't a story there for them. And I think that's why bringing the pilgrimage history to these sites is expansive for scholars, yes, but also for the visitors, for the tourism
Mhm.
aspects of sites. We don't, there aren't, it's difficult for Americans to get over to many of those cemeteries, and a lot of the Americans that do are really interested in the military history. But how many more Americans could we get over to the Meuse Argonne if they were drawn in by the pilgrimage aspect? And yes, you have to work at getting to the Meuse Argonne, but how could we share more stories of World War One and World War II in other places with more visitors, American and European or Asian in the case of the Philippines? How can we get those stories out there? We have to make it, I think, a little bit less of the let's talk about battles and tactics and watch the movie Patton 5 times club.
I am a person who, up until relatively recently, I would say the last 5 to 8 years, was interested in military history only to the extent that it shaped other parts of history or maybe my own family history. And so I think I'm a good case example of someone who may not have visited these places because I just didn't feel a personal connection to it or I didn't see the relevance. But what I have learned through the gateway of pilgrimages is this history is dynamic. It is there is so much to learn about the larger socio-political, cultural uh, aspects of what was going on at the exact time that a war was happening, or World War One in particular. I have learned so much about history of segregation, for example, and the experiences of African American mothers and soldiers and families through delving into the Gold Star Mothers pilgrimages. And I want to pause here because I think this is the exact type of history that is important that we all need to learn about, and we can do so through the vehicle of pilgrimages. And so been doing quite a lot of research just over the past week on a number of soldiers who were part of the Harlem Hellfighters and their mothers' pilgrimages. And I know this is an area of interest for you as well. And so I'd love to hear more about your interest in this particular aspect of military history, but also post-war commemoration, memorialization, and remembrance.
The segregation of the pilgrimages is essential to discuss anytime we talk about the pilgrimages. So, the pilgrimages were racially segregated to provide the background. There was an initial backlash against that, a massive letter writing campaign that happened. And some of the women who were invited, who were African American, chose not to go and protest. But I think it was maybe over 150 or so did choose to go. And couple points I want to talk about to start with first this expanding the scope of visitors, the demographics of visitors to military history sites. This segregation of the pilgrimages allows more Americans to see their story reflected there. We can diversify the people who are visiting these sites by making sure that their story is told. And since the reality is that a lot of the visitors to the cemeteries in Europe, at least, are European, this also allows the opportunity to share this aspect of American history with them. And ABMC is really doing that in their exhibits. I was able to work on some of those during my time there. It's really important that when we talk about military history, we don't fall into the trap of pure glorification. Yes, the American military had many successes in World War One. At the same time, that was a segregated military. While we celebrate the Harlem Hellfighters, the 369th, we have to always include why they were fighting under the French army. It was due to segregation. The Harlem Hellfighters just received the Congressional Gold Medal. And I was really fortunate to be invited to be an audience member at the events in on the Capitol that day and also at the French embassy. And one of the speakers really emphasized that that award demonstrates it's never too late to do the right thing. It won't make the gold medal won't make up for the suffering and the segregation and the discrimination that those men faced, but seeing their descendants in the audience, feeling pride in what their ancestors did and knowing that this country is recognizing them, that's meaningful. And it's also meaningful that we talk about those women who went to go visit the graves of the Harlem Hellfighters and other African Americans who were buried in those cemeteries. For at the European cemeteries, the ABMC cemeteries, they're not segregated, which is really incredible when you stop to think about it. Those graves are not segregated by race or rank. Um, at Arlington National Cemetery until 1948, that cemetery was segregated by race and rank, but overseas, those cemeteries are not. So that in and of itself deserves some critical thinking, particularly when compared with the segregated pilgrimages visiting an unsegregated cemetery. Gives a lot to think about and also allows us to explore and teach visitors about the long civil rights movement at the same time that they're learning about World War I military history.
It's one of the reasons this exact issue that you're talking about, this expansive platform to consider paradox is one of the most exciting elements for me of studying pilgrimages. Pilgrimages of any type, whether they're religious or secular, based in civil religion, um, or visits to ancestral homelands, all the different types of pilgrimages that exist, there is no one story. So, by nature, pilgrimages provide the opportunity for us to consider paradox and all of the different types of realities at the same time, because every single person that visits a site has a different motivation from the next person. So, there isn't necessarily, there may be one general motivation, but the specific interest and meaning that is created from the site, but also brought to the site is different. So, sort of this pilgrimage framework is a wonderful way to consider historical events and socio-political events and cultural events, and the meanings for people all at the same time, because they're all important, as people are approaching these sites with different views and different ways they create meaning from them. How did you how did you develop an interest in military history?
So, growing up in Northern Virginia, there were Civil War battlefields and historic sites all around me, and I was just always interested in history. My dad's retired Army, so when I showed some interest in this, he was excited and willing to encourage, but it was always me, as he will tell you, dragging him to the battlefield, saying, Daddy, take me to the battlefield, which continued with your conference when I dragged him with me to be my staff ride buddy after the conference. In other words, help me figure out how to drive in France. I'm happy to say that we did it with no trouble. Just don't drive in Paris. We just rented the car in Chateau Thierry. But yeah, if you it was surrounding me. I became fascinated by it. My parents, both of them encouraged it. My mom just made my dad take me to the battlefields, and that started a lifelong passion for military history, and it transitioned from the Civil War, which is, I like to say, the gateway drug for a lot of kids in the Virginia area, to eventually the American Revolution in college at William and Mary. And then after college, I had this incredible opportunity to teach at a boarding school in England for a year. And I was a teaching assistant in their history and drama departments. And kids in England, they go to the Western Front as their field trip. That's their Gettysburg. So you hop in a bus, you go in the Channel, and you go to the Western Front battlefields. We went to Ypres and the Somme on a field trip, and I just got sucked in to World War One and started to ask the question of, well, I'm here with these British school kids. They're being indoctrinated with the memory of the First World War. Where are the Americans here? Why aren't there Americans at these sites? Why didn't I learn about World War One in school? Why wasn't I reading this poetry? Why wasn't I understanding the symbolism of the poppy? We were there too. And as I read more about the American experience in World War I, it became very clear to me that we did a lot, but the memory of it had faded so much in the United States. So it was that comparison with the British and also the French and the Belgians a little bit that inspired me eventually, after some roundabout research papers, when I got to grad school after that year, to really start to focus on this question of why the US was not as focused on commemorating World War I in the present day, which through a roundabout way in the National Archives, as many of us have experienced, led me to the topic of my book.
What did you if you could summarize why Americans don't know about World War One, what would you say?
Americans used to know about World War I. They used to be, as you know, captivated, um, deeply focused on commemorating and remembering World War I throughout the 20s, the 30s, and the 40s during World War II as well. I haven't fully answered this question yet. I think part of it has to do with being overshadowed by World War II, certainly. I also think part of it has to do with these invisible memorials that were so popular, not just the ones being created by the women that I wrote about in the book, but other ones as well. That so much of the commemoration was tied to living people and living activities that didn't leave a lasting piece of evidence on the landscape, that it helped World War I fade away a little bit more.
Yeah,
But
that
I think
makes a
that's
lot of
a question
sense.
for us. Yeah, I think there's a lot more to be written, a lot more to be researched with the book. I tried to take a little slice of that question and get at it, but it's certainly not the full answer.
Have you noticed in your research that there is an increasing interest in World War One, especially after 2018, or do you sense that it is decreasing after the commemoration, the 100-year commemoration?
I don't know if I'm the best person. I mean, I'll give you my opinion, but it's gonna be biased because I talked to a lot of people that are interested in World War One. But I do think there has been a slight uptick. The work of the U.S. World War One Centennial Commission, which is now being stewarded by the Doughboy Foundation, they really have created a community of people who's interested in World War One. They have a newsletter that goes out. They do events, especially at the new National World War I Memorial in Washington, D.C. So I think that work has increased some of the engagement of Americans with World War I, particularly through educational materials they created and that other groups created during and after the centennial. Um, I, but I don't think it's where World War I historians and enthusiasts would like it to be yet. I think there are aspects of World War I that are starting to hook people in more. The Harlem Hellfighters, of course, has been one of those hooks for a while. You have Max Brooks, his illustrated graphic novel about the 369th, which is a fantastic way to get people who maybe don't want to read just a regular book of only text interested in World War One. That graphic novel can grip people and bring them in. Um, Also, I wanna give a shout out to the Hello Girls musical. I don't know if you're familiar with that yet. It's beautiful. It's a musical that was written about the story of the Hello Girls with Grace Banker, the chief operator, as its main character, as the protagonist. And it hasn't been on Broadway yet, but it's been off Broadway. It's starting to be really successful in community and regional productions across the country and a couple translated productions in Europe. And that show has really started to bring some interest to World War I as well. And I can say this based off of a personal experience in my outside of work time. I try to do a little bit of community theater, and I started convincing my girlfriends in one of the shows to listen to the Hello Girls musical. And these are friends who really don't have much interest in World War I, but patiently listened to me in the
Mhm.
dressing room when I was telling them, like, oh, I'm going to this conference in France, ladies, as this is right before the conference, but they all got hooked. They loved the musical. The music is fantastic. The story is fantastic. They've been getting interested in it. One of my friends, I'll give a shout out to Jessie. She actually came with me to Capitol Hill one day to a session that some historians we were doing to raise awareness about the effort for the Hello Girls Gold Medal. So I think it's pieces like the Hello Girls musical. Maybe if there are movies that are going to come out, those can start hooking people into this more.
Mhm. I imagine it's an interesting space for you to occupy, to be interested in World War One, but military history. I mean, you talked about your interest in the Civil War, uh, the American Revolution, which is going to be even bigger over the coming years. Also, you mentioned World War Two, and you have focused. Your scholarship has focused on the stories of women in these contexts, and it must be interesting. I mean, my mind is thinking it must be interesting to also be a woman in the scholarly space within military history, a space that has been traditionally occupied by male historians and male scholars. What has that been like for you to be a woman in this space?
It has its challenges, but it's also really fulfilling. I like to tell people that since I've been a kid, my interests have been Broadway, ballet, and battlefields. And that has stayed the same,
This
although
is a very
perhaps
interesting composition for a personality profile.
it's different. You don't always find it, but anybody who's known me for a while would say, "Yep, ballet, battlefields, and Broadway. That's Allison." So I have just embraced it, and it's taken me a while to embrace it. I would say I fought for a while against calling myself a women's historian. I went into grad school wanting to study your early America, military history, and cultural history. And I did not plan on studying women's history. And I didn't want to be called a women's historian for a while because I was afraid that would prevent me from being accepted or succeeding in the field of military history. But as I matured and also got deeper into the scholarship in the archives, I embraced it because I started to understand that military history, again, like we said before, is more than just battles and tactics. The professor I worked with in graduate school, the military historian, Dr. John Sumida, who passed away recently, had a really big impact on me and I think all of his students. He was intimidating, he was intense, and he would tell his graduate students, "You may not make it through this graduate course." And he would tell his undergrads when I was TAing for him, "If you came to this intro to military history course to learn about weapons and talk about battles, you're in the wrong place because that's not what military history is." And as I studied with him, I embraced that more and more and expanded it to a place that he was not telling me to expand it to, but he was very supportive of looking at women's roles, looking at the pilgrimage, looking at the cultural aspects of it. And there is a movement of military historians now, many of whom are women, but not all, who are pushing to expand the narrative and the focus of military history, particularly at the Society for Military History. There's been a group of leading female scholars who are trying to make this field more accepting and welcoming to women in particular. And at the last time I went to the conference was, I guess, in 2024. So I didn't go this year, but in 2024, they had a whole happy hour for women for female military historians, and they gave out stickers that said "Female Military Historians of SMH." I forget what it said exactly, but I have it on my bulletin board at work. So we're banding together like those women in my book. We're saying we belong here and that we can do traditional military history, and many of us do, but that doesn't preclude us from trying to get the field to expand. And that's the only way that military history is going to survive because I'm sure you know a lot of academia looks down on military history, doesn't consider it serious or that it's not making new inroads in scholarship, but it absolutely is. And that's through different perspectives and bringing in new voices and making everybody feel welcome. So if you're a woman out there and you're listening and you're interested in military history, come on, join us. We got room for you. We have room for everybody. And just because you might not look or sound like those other historians doesn't mean you don't have a place.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you for saying that, and also for illuminating the work that you and your colleagues at SMH are doing to broaden.
Not as much me.
Uh,
I was
well,
just in
okay, I'll say
attendance.
your
A lot of
colleagues. Yeah.
others.
To expect, and it'll be a wonderful moment um, when all historians are writing about all experiences rather than this needing the labor for writing about women's military history is falling on the shoulders of women military historians.
Yeah, and if I could just add another example. So I have a good friend who I'm going to give a shout out as well, Elizabeth Hyman, who's a historian of the Holocaust. And her first book is coming out this month. It's called Girl Bandits, and it's about the armed Jewish female resistance fighters of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. Um, Maybe that would not be traditionally classified as military history, but I define that as military history. And when she was working on this book, um, we had a lot of discussions about, well, what if another book comes out about this and these women are getting more publicity, they're becoming more well known. And I said, Liz, if we can have how many hundreds of books about the D-Day invasion, shouldn't we have just as many books out there about these armed female resistance leaders in the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising? And that's the way that we're going to expand military history,
Mhm.
by having more books, by having more perspectives, by having more people talk about it. So go check out Liz's book as well.
Say the name of it. You
Uh, Girl Bandits. I forget the rest of the title. Let me
I've
look it up.
seen it. I've seen you commenting on it on LinkedIn. Uh,
That's military history, folks.
yeah.
It is military history. Maybe didn't take place on a battlefield, but the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, I mean, she's really expanding the narrative, and I'm very proud of
Yeah.
her.
That's amazing. Go check out the book, people listening and watching this. Uh, I have a couple of questions that are sort of follow-ons to my question about you being uh, a woman in military history. Um, as part of your work as a historian, military history is one aspect of your work. I'd love to hear more. You recently had a baby, and I I'm also a mother, and being a mother has changed my views, and my perspective in many ways, and actually has, inspired the historical aspects of my scholarship in ways that I did not expect, but so I'll talk about that in a few minutes. Um, I'd love to hear how your experience, having a baby has impacted you as a historian and a scholar.
Thank you for asking that. I'm still processing it. This is quite a transformational experience, isn't it? Wow. People warn you about what becoming a mother is like, but I did not get it in until it happened. I think right now, from where I stand, it has made me even more connected to the emotions of the work that you and I do. And I
Mhm.
look, I do community theater for fun. Actors are trained to be emotional. I've always been in touch with my emotions, but I feel these emotions even more now. As an example, I spend a lot of time in cemeteries, and in older cemeteries, you'll often see these graves of infants
Mm.
who die the day of their birth or a couple days after or a month or two after. And I am having trouble even looking at those headstones. Like, I feel tears coming to my eyes right now, honestly, even talking about that. I never had that reaction in a cemetery before, but after having a baby and you see that, it gets you. I think I haven't dug back into my Gold Star pilgrimage work as much since having my daughter, but I do already feel more pain and more of a connection to that pain. I cannot imagine what those women went through. And in fact, I don't even want to think about it because I can't fathom that level of pain. And I had moments when researching this book and doing other projects in the National Archives, looking through the burial case files of World War I and opening up those folders to find one of the identification discs in there, sometimes still covered with the dirt of France. And I have cried in the archives holding those. I don't even know what my reaction would be right now. Everything just feels deeper. It feels more emotional. Um, I think as a historian, as a women's historian, it's gotten me to think more about the physical aspects of motherhood that constrained women. Um, in my book chapter, I talk about the rest houses for the pilgrimages and how they were modeled a little bit on restrooms, ladies' restrooms in the United States. And as I was researching that, it said, oh, the women in small towns, they needed a place to, go feed their child. I did not understand what that meant until having a baby. And I did not understand how women in the past were so tied and chained to their home until I breastfed my baby.
Mhm.
That, that just makes me as a historian think so much more about the technology that has enabled women to leave the home more. Thinking about the breast pump. Um, this is probably not what a lot of your listeners came to this podcast for, but we're talking about women's history. The breast pump and a portable electric breast pump, that has been transformational for women being able to get out into the workforce, to leave the home at all, to do anything other than keep a baby alive. It's gotten me to think about that more. It's gotten me to think about wet nurses, enslaved wet nurses, what that really meant, things that I've read about and studied, I didn't understand on a practical and emotional level until having a baby. Like just how much work it takes to keep a newborn alive and how that truly is a labor unlike any job I've ever done.
Mhm. Yeah,
I
and
did it 3 times, Heather. I don't know.
and um the emotional connection to I have in you referenced the burial files, which I've been reviewing a lot of them that are digitized. This I'm getting very attached to the women through reading these, very attached to their sons. It's hard for me to disengage, after reading, particularly there are so many letters that women wrote, asking for some type of, a help or accommodation while on the pilgrimage, whether that's they wanted to stay with a particular woman or they wanted to go. Many women were immigrants to the United States from Europe, and they wanted to go visit Sweden or places in France, or England on the pilgrimage because they couldn't afford to make a separate trip. Many of the health issues that women encountered during these pilgrimages, ranging from panic attacks to many of them were elderly and they were diabetic. I read of a situation, a woman got a cut on her foot and it was treated with white bacon and a penny. So I went into this like, what is this type of medicine? And it's kind of a folk cure for wounds. And so that was interesting just to see also how the women's mental health was conceptualized, where there was specific training for the army officers who escorted these pilgrimages around quote unquote hysteria, which would have been a normal response to visiting the grave of your child, to have this sort of dramatic emotional expression of course this is not something exceptional, this is within the bounds of normal for human emotional expression. So that has been difficult, but I also so the historical part of my research, and I'm just now sort of becoming comfortable with talking about historical research because I did not do a PhD in history, and so I'm in a bit of a liminal space myself around how to categorize this, um, without saying being a historian, but doing historical research. So that's a whole other podcast episode probably. But I am finding the need for documentation of my own life, and my family's that my ancestry in a way that is very different after having children, because I want to ensure that they have an understanding, and I feel a sense of responsibility to track down every document I can find so that I can pass that on to my children. So the historical research has become, I think, paramount in my own work, and part of that is because of having children.
No, I definitely relate to that. I mean, I've had an interest in genealogy for a while, but there is a sense that I don't want my daughter to have questions about her
Mhm.
family like my parents and I are having questions about our family history right now with things that we will probably never get answers or closure to about
Mhm.
what happened to some of our family members. As you get older and have children, or if you're just historically minded, you want to know that because it's part of who you are and your heritage. And yeah, I
So my kids say, can we do something without visiting a cemetery?" So cemeteries have really come to the fore over the last 5 years, where, uh, stopping and looking at a cemetery, or going on a family vacation, and cemeteries are a part of it. I think they wish that may not, that was not so present in their lives, but cemeteries have become, kind of a joke, just in terms of how often we visit them. But also, my oldest daughter is a high school senior now, and she's very interested in memory diplomacy, and so I'm actually seeing how the work I've been doing and the research that I've been doing, and introducing her to this important work, and the service members, and the Gold Star mothers, and all of the pilgrimages after the war are now shaping her future, and so that's been really amazing.
That's incredible, and I think it's such a great example that your kids are seeing your passion and your profession and your projects, and I hope that my daughter sees that and values that, that mom's work is important and it makes a difference, just like dad's work is
Mhm.
important. Yeah, I think I still have a lot to process about it. I haven't gotten back to the overseas cemeteries since becoming a mother, but I certainly spent time at cemeteries here in the US, and I do look at them differently. And I think there's a sense that I had before becoming a mom that is only going to heighten, and that's a connection to those graves of the people whose lives we have studied. I very much relate to you when you say you've become emotionally connected to those women, those pilgrims. I feel that too. I feel that at the cemeteries I visit, every time I go to the Muse Argonne and leave, I feel like I'm leaving behind the boys.
Mhm.
I feel connected to them, and I wonder, yeah, I wonder how that will deepen. I don't know. I don't know.
You have lots of time. Your daughter is just she's little,
Little.
so yeah, there's lots of time to develop that. I I wanna ask one final question. You and I met because of a conference 2 years ago that was a bit of an experiment. The conference was bilingual. The edited volume that we have, that is being published soon, is bilingual. Some chapters are in English, some chapters are in French. And you and I had corresponded before the conference, but we had the opportunity to meet in person in France, and it was wonderful. And having your father there also was really, fun. And I and I you
Says
have
hello.
yeah, well, tell her hello. You have since said that it was, a transformative journey for you. It became a pilgrimage for you, in addition to presenting your wonderful scholarship on pilgrimages and women and memorialization, it also became a pilgrimage for you. And I'd like to end with hearing about the experience for you and why you say it was a personal pilgrimage.
It was just an amazing conference to be able to connect with all of those different scholars and practitioners, particularly from France and Belgium. So that to me was extremely valuable, those connections, meeting and getting to know the director of the museum at Verdun and all of the folks from the French Ministry of Defense and lots of your friends who I'm sure have been on this podcast. So those transnational relationships were important. Representing America there was really important. Making sure that the American story got told, but also it was my opportunity to visit the World War I sites from the United States that I hadn't gotten to yet. I'd been out years before while working as an intern at ABMC. They, for some reason, decided to send us on a 2-week trip to France, which was incredible. And we actually stayed in what's now called the Visitor Center at the Meuse Argonne. There used to be an apartment up there. We stayed there. So I got to spend some really incredible time in the Meuse and other sites, but didn't go to a lot of the other sites. So I was able to go to Aisne-Marne, Wazan, many of the other cemeteries that I hadn't been to. So that was a pilgrimage for me. There was also another aspect to it. I'm working on a project about the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, which I'm not going to go into on this podcast, but perhaps we can talk about in another episode. And the experience of the conference and the staff ride I did on my own with my dad afterwards allowed me to visit many of those sites. We went to what's now called Chalon and Champagne. In 1921, it was Chalon-sur-Marne, and got into the City Hall building where the unknown soldier was selected. The folks there were very confused and very understanding and very kind as I was excitedly taking photos and having a moment of deep personal connection to that site, that lieu de mémoire, where the unknown soldier was selected. So to go to that site and the other cemeteries where the candidates for the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier were placed, for me was really consequential in the finalization of that book manuscript. I also think it was just a bonding experience. I think for those of us who stayed at the Hotel Campanile, if you know, you know.
The campground?
Like the French truck stop, as I like to describe it to people. Poor Heather, you were but it was just a group of people that I felt really bonded. It was only 2 days. I hope we can meet up again or do another conference maybe here in the US. But it was an immersion. It was an immersion into French academia and French scholarship. A lot of it I did not understand because my French is very elementary, but it made me feel like I was very much a part of that community of scholars. So multi-level pilgrimage, I guess. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to
Thank
join.
you
And
for taking the opportunity. It was fantastic to have you there and to see you and hear your work. Your presentation was amazing. It was so
you.
well done, and so it was wonderful to have you uh, in this group of people. And as I said, it was an experiment. How do we have a conference in French and in English? And I think one of the things we learned is that real-time translation is necessary. It's very hard to
So
have
yeah,
significant dialogue when we are not communicating in both languages, and that's a unique challenge because for a translator slash interpreter to be present for 2 full days, it would have to be multiple people, probably 4 people or 6 people. It is a challenge to be speaking that much and thinking in 2 languages. So we need these UN headsets where people can
exactly.
hear the translation happening as the presentations are going. We did try something different at an event that I coordinated this summer, which is that we handed out the speeches. They were short speeches, not entire papers, in the other language, so people could read along. And I do think that helped a bit, but again, it's difficult. It's difficult to coordinate these types of events in a meaningful way and to be able to highlight the work of all different types of scholar. I mean, it was multidisciplinary too, so there was a language, there was a disciplinary language issue in addition to a uh, there being challenges with French and English. So, have I missed anything that's important in your work or to ask about before we end today?
I think we covered it. This was really comprehensive, and it just got me so excited to talk to you again, and I hope that we can do another version of that conference
Me
and
too.
bring more people in. I think it's you've created a community of scholars and practitioners who are interested in pilgrimages, and I hope we can keep that going, and
Me too.
yeah.
I think we have lots to talk about.
We do. I could talk to you for hours, but I think I feel like I've talked a great amount already, so I will leave it at that. But this has been fantastic, and thank you. And thank
Thank
you
you.
to those listening.
Yeah, thank you.